Sweet mash, sour mash, and why it's important. That is what we are talking about today. Let's dive right in. Welcome back to another episode of Whiskey and Wine, where we try to make the world of whiskey and wine a little bit more approachable for more people. Today, obviously, we are talking about the difference between sweet mash and sour mash. Very high level overview, real quick. Sour mash is just going to be reusing some of the leftover stillage, whereas sweet mash is going to be using fresh ingredients. So if you don't want to stay to the end of the video, there you go. Now, for those of you who actually want to stick around and want to get into the nerdy details, let's talk about it. To understand sweet mash, let's start by talking about sour mash. The concept of sour mash really goes back to 1818, even though some people are going to say it was a little bit after that. We're going to go back to 1818 at the first written instance of this, and that was from Catherine Carpenter. She documented the process of reusing some of the leftover stillage or the grain and water mixture at the end of a distillation run and putting that back into the fermentation to kickstart it a little bit, but also to kind of make the whiskey a little bit more consistent and not be as volatile as some other people's whiskey. Now, this process is really used by almost all big distilleries. It's a little bit easier to do, and we're going to get into why that is. So when you make whiskey, you're going to have your fermentation going. You're going to take that wort, that water, grain, yeast, sugar mixture that does have some alcohol in it, and then you're going to put that into your still. You're going to distill that, you're going to get your alcohol, you're going to take that, you're going to age it, and then boom, there's your bourbon. Now, originally when people were making whiskey, they would do that, take that stillage, that leftover grain and water mixture that's kind of just left over from your distillation, and they'd either throw it away, they would give it to some farmers, give it to their cows, because it is very nutrient dense. Problem was, one, it was kind of wasteful, if you will, but then when they were done, they had to restart the fermentation. That took a while, and also you had to make sure you were cleaning it out really well. We all know that back then, 1818 or earlier, cleaning supplies really were not what they are today. So it was very easy for bacteria to start to grow and then creep into the whiskey and make it so you couldn't really make a good whiskey anymore. Now, once this sour mash technique started to be used, the whiskey that you were making was one, more consistent, but two, it was going to be a little bit stronger against those bacteria that were going to try to creep in. Now, like I mentioned, there was someone else who's really credited with the perfection of the sour mash technique, and that was going to be Dr. James Crowe. Dr. Crowe is a physician and wow, I'm losing words today. He's a physician and a chemist from Scotland. So the dude's really smart. He understands what's going on during fermentation. He understands what's going on during distillation. So he was able to figure out exactly why the sour mash technique was working, which is what we're going to get into now. So I had already mentioned that the sour mash technique was working really well because it was making things more consistent. They were stronger against the bacteria, but it was also making a better environment for the yeast. Yeast is very, very particular. It needs the right temperature, it needs the right environment. All of these specific things need to be right for it to make as much alcohol as possible. One of those things is having the right pH level. So if the pH was too high, the yeast did not survive as much and it was not going to make as much alcohol. So using that sour mash, we were able to lower the pH, and make a better environment for the yeast, and now we're maximizing the alcohol production during the fermentation. Now, as science has progressed and the world's progressed, sanitization has become a bigger thing. So we're able to clean out our equipment enough that we don't have to just rely on having a resistant whiskey, which is why we're able to have things like this sweet mash now. So if sour mash is reusing some of that leftover stillage, sweet mash is just the opposite. Nothing is reused, and you are just restarting fresh every single time. We're able to do this again because science and sanitization, and we're able to actually make sure things are clean, the pH is where it needs to be, all of these things because science. Typically what these distilleries will do when they are making their sweet mash, when they are done with one run of that fermentation, they will seal off that fermentation tank and completely clean it off. This is usually done by blasting in some really hot steam, making sure everything is completely dead, and then washing it out. Now you can restart. So we talked about the benefits of having a sour mash. So why would anyone really want to do sweet mash if you're having to waste some of that leftover stillage? You don't really know what to do with it. It could be less consistent. There are some really cool benefits to it. And as a wine person as well, some of these benefits I really, really enjoy. So, similarly to wine, year to year, your wine is typically going to taste a little bit different unless you're getting a standard wine that's just always blended together to always taste the same. Grapes don't grow the same every single year. And the same thing can be said for whiskeys. They do not come out the same every single year. The crops are going to be different, the temperature is different. So it shouldn't be the same every single year. When you are doing the sweet mash, this is going to allow those intricacies, those differences to creep in. So, batch to batch, your sweet mash is going to typically taste a little bit different. Granted, you can really try to make it taste the same by blending, but if you're doing single barrels or you're doing just small batches, they're all going to taste a little different from each other. The other piece that I really like is that all of that leftover stillage, obviously the other distilleries are taking it and doing the similar thing where they are giving it to the farmers, but there's even more coming from these sweet mash distilleries and going back to these farmers. And I just find that really cool. These cows are getting this nutrient dense meal, and that's just awesome. Coming from, or not me, but Heather being a farmer, it's one of those really interesting things, and I just really, really appreciate it. So let's take a quick look at some of the distilleries that are doing sweet mash. So not only do we have Hard Truth with their sweet mash, we also have Wilderness Trail and Peerless, who essentially exclusively do sweet mash. So I grabbed an excerpt from both Peerless and Wilderness Trail from their distillers and why they do what. So I'm going to pop that up and I'm going to read those excerpts. So from Wilderness Trail, we have this coming from Jarrett Smith, the project manager. It says, our sweet mash process lets us highlight many things, though it leaves you open to more contamination issues and losing batch to batch continuity. So that forces us into a higher standard with our cleaning and fermentations. Popping over to Peerless real quick. This is coming from Caleb Kilborn. Sweet mash requires us to pay extremely close attention to our cleanliness. While the soured effect in sour mashing intrinsically makes it resilient against contamination, a sweet mash is vulnerable in its early stages. This requires a lot of time and dedication to properly cleaning and sanitizing our equipment. Through this level of attention to detail, we are able to safeguard the batches, ensuring our desired results. So, really interesting thing about both of these two. Obviously, they both said that you have to have very, very clean areas and then you have to have a very high attention to detail, which is why both of them have exceptional whiskeys they are producing. You might not have heard of Wilderness Trail as much, but Peerless, I'm betting you've heard of, and you know that what they're producing is really, really, really good. I'm a huge Peerless fan. But the fun part here is Wilderness Trail has a very interesting origin story. The guy that got it started is incredibly intelligent and also now runs a very successful business called, what is it? Firm Solutions, which is a really just a company within the yeast industry to teach you about making whiskey, but having the right yeast for the type of whiskey that you want to make, the environment, all sorts of things. So they really got into the nitty gritty science of it, of what is actually going to work and why is it going to work. Now, there's also a couple other distilleries that are using sweet mash. And if you look who is running those and when they started, a lot of them were in contact with Wilderness Trail to figure out how are we going to do this? What type of yeast should we be doing? And how do we make a good sweet mash whiskey? But why do we really care about this? Again, if you're just someone who likes to drink your whiskey, then it doesn't really have any effect on you. But if you made it this far in the video, I'm assuming you care a little bit. And the interesting thing here is if you're getting something that is sweet mashed, again, you are going to have that little bit of variance from batch to batch, which again is really interesting. You might end up with a batch that has a little bit more of like a brown sugar note to it, or a little bit more of a cinnamon note to it, or more of a vanilla note. whatever it may be. You're going to get all sorts of these different little intricacies into each batch. And that makes it almost more exciting to me. Instead of just having, oh, I know what this whiskey is going to taste like, it's consistent. It's, oh, hey, there's a new batch. I want to go try that batch. And it makes you want to go back to the it makes you want to go back to the distillery. It makes you want to buy their next product to see if it's going to be good, to see if it's going to be better. It's a little bit of a gamble, but as someone who really enjoys wine, it's a ton of fun. Obviously, I'm a little bit of a whiskey nerd. I really appreciate getting into these nerdy, nitty gritty things. So I'm going to go nerd out about this guy because unfortunately, I don't know too much about them. I'm going to do a little bit of research and enjoy my sweet mash. So, as always, glad you're here and I hope you learned something. Cheers.